in the same state of seclusion or spiritual quarantine in which, for his own safety, primitive man puts his human gods and other dangerous characters. Thus, when the Maoris went on the war path, they were sacred or taboo in the highest degree, and they and their friends at home had to observe strictly many curious customs over and above the numerous taboos of ordinary life. They became, in the irreverent language of Europeans, who knew them in the old fighting days, tabooed an inch thick; and as for the leader of the expedition, he was quite unapproachable. Similarly, when the Israelites marched forth to war, they were bound by certain rules of ceremonial purity identical with rules observed by Maoris and Australian blackfellows on the war path. The vessels they used were sacred, and they had to practise continence and a custom of personal cleanliness, of which the original motive, if we may judge from the avowed motive of savages who conformed to the same custom, was a fear lest the enemy should obtain the refuse of their persons, and thus be enabled to work their destruction by magic. Among some Indian tribes of North America a young warrior, in his first campaign, had to conform to certain customs, of which two were identical with the observances imposed by the same Indians on girls at their first menstruation. The vessels he ate and drank out of might be touched by no other person, and he was forbidden to scratch his head or any other part of his body with his fingers. If he could not help scratching himself, he had to do it with a stick. The latter rule, like the one which forbids a tabooed person to feed himself with his own fingers, seems to rest on the supposed sanctity or pollution, whichever we choose to call it, of the tabooed hands. Moreover, among these Indian tribes, the men on the war path had always to sleep at night with their faces turned towards their own country. However uneasy the posture, they might not change it. They might not sit upon the bare ground, nor wet their feet, nor walk on a beaten path if they could help it. When they had no choice but to walk on a path, they sought to counteract the ill effect of doing so by doctoring their legs with certain medicines or charms which they carried with them for the purpose. No member of the party was permitted to step over the legs, hands, or body of any other member who chanced to be sitting or lying on the ground, and it was equally forbidden to step over his blanket, gun, tomahawk, or anything that belonged to him. If this rule was inadvertently broken, it became the duty of the member whose person or property had been stepped over to knock the other member down, and it was similarly the duty of that other to be knocked down peaceably and without resistance. The vessels out of which the warriors ate their food were commonly small bowls of wood or birch bark, with marks to distinguish the two sides. In marching from home the Indians invariably drank out of one side of the bowl, and in returning they drank out of the other. When on their way home they came within a day's march of the village, they hung up all their bowls on trees, or threw them away on the prairie, doubtless to prevent their sanctity or defilement from being communicated, with disastrous effects, to their friends, just as we have seen that the vessels and clothes of the sacred Mikado, of women at childbirth and menstruation, and of persons defiled by contact with the dead, are destroyed or laid aside for a similar reason. The first 4 times that an Apache Indian goes out on the war path he is bound to refrain from scratching his head with his fingers and from letting water touch his lips. Hence he scratches his head with a stick, and drinks through a hollow reed or cane. Stick and reed are attached to the warrior's belt, and to each other by a leathern thong. The rule not to scratch their heads with their fingers, but to use a stick for the purpose instead, was regularly observed by Ojebways on the war path. With regard to the Creek Indians and kindred tribes, we are told that they "will not cohabit with women while they are out at war. They religiously abstain from every kind of intercourse, even with their own wives, for the space of 3 days and nights before they go to war, and so after they return home, because they are to sanctify themselves." Among the Ba Pedi and Ba Thonga tribes of South Africa, not only have the warriors to abstain from women, but the people left behind in the villages are also bound to continence. They think that any incontinence on their part would cause thorns to grow on the ground traversed by the warriors, and that success would not attend the expedition. Why exactly many savages have made it a rule to refrain from women in time of war we cannot say for certain, but we may conjecture that their motive was a superstitious fear lest, on the principles of sympathetic magic, close contact with women should infect them with feminine weakness and cowardice. Similarly, some savages imagine that contact with a woman in childbed enervates warriors and enfeebles their weapons. Indeed, the Kayans of central Borneo go so far as to hold that to touch a loom or women's clothes would so weaken a man that he would have no success in hunting, fishing, and war. Hence it is not merely sexual intercourse with women that the savage warrior sometimes shuns; he is careful to avoid the sex altogether. Thus among the hill tribes of Assam not only are men forbidden to cohabit with their wives during or after a raid, but they may not eat food cooked by a woman; nay, they should not address a word even to their own wives. Once a woman, who unwittingly broke the rule by speaking to her husband while he was under the war taboo, sickened and died when she learnt the awful crime she had committed. End of Chapter 20a.